Sometimes, violence emerges from places we least expect, from within a peaceful home, a place that is supposed to be safe and filled with love. But what happens when the human mind becomes its own worst enemy? This is the tragic story of Sydney Powell, a girl who fell victim to mental disorders and ultimately took an action that changed her life forever. Sydney Powell's case is one that intertwines the devastating consequences of untreated mental illness with the tragic breakdown of a family. It began as a seemingly normal story of a young woman trying to navigate the challenges of university life, but it ended in brutal tragedy with the death of her mother, Brenda Powell. The events of March 3, 2020, were the culmination of Sydney's battle with schizophrenia, an illness that had been quietly eroding her sense of reality for years. Sydney Powell, then 19, had been attending the University of Mount Union. She had told her parents she was doing well in school, keeping up with her classes, and maintaining her place on campus. In reality, however, she was no longer a student. Her grades had fallen so far that she was expelled from the university. This critical piece of information was something Sydney hid from her parents, continuing to act as though everything was normal. She even stayed in hotels near the campus, pretending to attend classes and keeping up the facade of her academic success. Her mental health had been deteriorating over time, with signs of delusion and erratic behavior beginning to emerge. Friends and roommates had noticed troubling behavior, including Sydney lying about her student status and trying to access buildings she was no longer permitted to enter. By the time her parents discovered the truth, Sydney's mind was already on the verge of a breakdown. The pressure to keep her lies hidden, coupled with the unraveling of her sense of reality, became too much to bear. The day of the murder, Brenda Powell had a conversation with university officials who informed her about Sydney's expulsion. Brenda decided to confront Sydney about the issue at their home. As they discussed the situation, Sydney, overwhelmed with fear and anxiety, lashed out. She grabbed a cast-iron skillet and struck her mother, then continued the assault by stabbing Brenda nearly 30 times. The sheer brutality of the attack was shocking, even to the investigators who arrived at the scene. The phone call Brenda had with university officials abruptly ended when the attack began. Those on the other end of the line heard disturbing noises, thuds, screams, and other strange sounds before the line went dead. They immediately contacted the police, who rushed to the Powell home in Akron, Ohio. Upon arrival, they found Sydney in a hysterical state, claiming an intruder had broken in and killed her mother. However, bloody footprints and other evidence quickly contradicted her story. It was clear that Sydney had attempted to stage a break-in to cover up the crime. The crime scene was gruesome. Brenda Powell was found lying in a pool of blood, with severe head trauma from the skillet and multiple stab wounds. The police noted that Sydney appeared detached from reality, shaking uncontrollably and clawing at the ground. Her behavior was erratic, but the physical evidence, including cuts on her hands and the fact that the footprints matched her shoes, led to her immediate arrest. In the months following the murder, Sydney was held in a psychiatric hospital where she was evaluated by multiple doctors. They diagnosed her with schizophrenia, a severe mental disorder characterized by delusions, hallucinations, and impaired thinking. During her trial, Sydney's defense team argued that she was in the midst of a psychotic break when she killed her mother. They presented evidence from 3 separate physicians, all of whom agreed that while Sydney experienced periods of lucidity, these were interrupted by significant psychotic episodes. They argued that the murder was a result of her deteriorating mental state and that she had not fully understood the consequences of her actions. Schizophrenia typically emerges in late adolescence or early adulthood, and in Sydney's case, it had likely been affecting her perception of reality for some time. The illness, exacerbated by the stress of her academic failures, played a critical role in the events leading up to the murder. Prosecutors, however, painted a different picture. They argued that while Sydney may have had mental health issues, she was aware of what she was doing during the murder. They pointed to her attempts to cover up the crime, breaking a window to stage a break-in, changing her story, and trying to prevent officers from entering certain areas of the home. These actions, they claimed, indicated that Sydney knew right from wrong and was attempting to avoid responsibility for her actions. Despite the defense's argument that Sydney should be declared legally insane and unfit to stand trial, the jury ultimately sided with the prosecution. They found Sydney guilty of the murder of her mother. She was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. This means that Sydney will not be eligible for release until 2038, when she will be 38 years old. The sentencing was a devastating moment for the Powell family. Steve Powell, Sydney's father, expressed his heartbreak, stating that this tragedy was not the true reflection of who Sydney was. He described the murder as a brief moment where something went horribly wrong, a moment driven by the mental illness that had taken over his daughter's life. Despite the horror of the crime, the family continued to support Sydney, acknowledging the role her illness had played in the tragedy. Sydney's case sheds light on the challenges of navigating the legal system when mental illness is involved. While it was clear that she suffered from schizophrenia, the question of her culpability remained at the heart of the trial. Was she fully aware of her actions, or was she driven to commit the crime by the delusions and psychosis that had taken over her mind? This is a question that has been debated in courts for decades, and Sydney's case is a stark reminder of the complexities involved. In the aftermath of the trial, mental health advocates have pointed to the case an example of why early intervention and treatment for mental illnesses like schizophrenia are critical. Sydney's descent into psychosis may have been preventable if she had received the help she needed earlier. Her case underscores the importance of recognizing the signs of mental illness and ensuring that those who are struggling receive the appropriate care and support. As Sydney serves her sentence, her family remains committed to supporting her. They have written letters to the court, expressing their unwavering love for Sydney and their hope that she will one day receive the treatment she needs. While the legal system has delivered its verdict, the Powell family continues to grapple with the emotional and psychological fallout of the tragedy. Sydney Powell's story is one of heartbreak, mental illness, and the devastating impact that untreated psychiatric disorders can have on individuals and families. It serves as a stark reminder of the importance of mental health awareness and the need for comprehensive mental health services. While the court may have closed the book on Sydney's case, the lessons from her story will resonate for years to come. Sydney Powell's trial in October 2023 revolved around the brutal murder of her mother, Brenda Powell. In March 2020, Sydney, a 19-year-old college student, was found guilty of hitting her mother with a cast-iron skillet and stabbing her nearly 30 times after Brenda discovered that Sydney had been expelled from the University of Mount Union. The defense argued that Sydney was suffering from schizophrenia and that her actions were the result of a psychotic break. 3 medical experts confirmed her diagnosis, emphasizing that Sydney was not fully aware of her actions at the time of the murder. However, the prosecution countered that her attempt to stage the scene as a break-in indicated a level of awareness and intent. Despite the defense's insanity plea, Sydney was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The trial of Sydney Powell, which concluded in October 2023, presented a complex legal battle, heavily focused on her mental state at the time of the murder of her mother, Brenda Powell, in March 2020. This case captivated the public due to the brutality of the crime and the significant mental health issues that emerged during the investigation. Sydney, who was just 19 at the time, was convicted of killing her mother after a shocking series of events that highlighted the tragic intersection of mental illness and violence. The incident began when Brenda Powell, a respected child life specialist, was on the phone with officials from the University of Mount Union. During the conversation, The university informed Brenda that her daughter, Sydney, had been expelled due to poor academic performance. The university had contacted Brenda because Sydney had been hiding her expulsion from her family, pretending to still be enrolled. In the midst of this revelation, Sydney attacked her mother, hitting her in the head with a cast iron skillet and then stabbing her nearly 30 times. The call was cut short as school officials heard disturbing sounds, including screams and thudding, prompting them to call the police. When police arrived at the scene, they found Sydney covered in blood, attempting to prevent officers from entering certain parts of the house. She initially claimed that an intruder had broken in and attacked her mother, but evidence at the scene, including Sydney's bloody footprints and cuts on her hands, quickly disproved this claim. The crime scene was brutal, with Brenda found lying in a pool of blood in her bedroom. Despite being rushed to the hospital, she died from her injuries. After her arrest, Sydney's behavior raised immediate concerns about her mental health. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia while being held at a psychiatric unit. The defense team built its case around this diagnosis, arguing that Sydney had experienced a psychotic break during the attack and was not fully aware of her actions. 3 different mental health experts evaluated Sydney, all concluding that she suffered from schizophrenia, a disorder that had likely been affecting her for some time, but had gone untreated. The defense team presented Sydney's schizophrenia as the primary reason for the murder, pointing to her history of delusions and erratic behavior. They argued that her mental illness had clouded her judgment, making her incapable of understanding the consequences of her actions. Sydney had a long history of hiding her academic struggles from her parents, and the pressure of maintaining this facade, combined with her deteriorating mental state, culminated in the violent outbursts against her mother. Her defense lawyer, Donald Malarchik, argued that Sydney was not in control of her actions during the attack and should be found not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution, however, took a different stance. They argued that while Sydney might have been suffering from mental health issues, she was still aware of her actions on the day of the murder. Prosecutors pointed to her attempts to stage the crime scene to look like a break-in and her calm demeanor when answering the phone as evidence that she knew what she was doing. A clinical psychologist for the prosecution, Dr. Sylvia Obradovish, testified that Sydney's behavior did not align with the typical symptoms of schizophrenia. She argued that Sydney's actions were purposeful and that the brutal nature of the attack suggested that she was fully aware of the harm she was causing. The jury had to grapple with the conflicting expert testimony. On one side, they heard from the defense's doctors who supported the insanity defense, while on the other side, they heard the prosecution argue that Sydney's actions were deliberate. The case also sheds light on the importance of early intervention and treatment for mental illnesses like schizophrenia. If Sydney's condition had been recognized and treated earlier, this tragedy might have been avoided. Ultimately, the jury found Sydney guilty of murder. She was convicted on multiple counts, including 2 counts of murder, tampering with evidence, and assault. The court sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Sydney's family, particularly her father, Stephen Powell, continued to support her throughout the trial, emphasizing that the person who committed the murder was not the real Sydney, but someone deeply affected by mental illness. Stephen Powell even read a letter in court, expressing the family's hope for leniency and emphasizing that Brenda would have wanted Sydney to receive treatment for her mental condition in the least restrictive environment possible. Despite the family's plea for leniency, the court was firm in its ruling, concluding that Sydney's actions were too severe to warrant a lesser sentence. The court's decision left Sydney's family heartbroken, as they believed that her mental illness had played a significant role in the murder and that she should have been treated, not imprisoned. The verdict highlighted the challenges the legal system faces when mental illness intersects with violent crime. Sydney Powell's case is a reminder of the complexities involved in cases where mental health issues are a factor. While the defense presented strong evidence of her schizophrenia, the prosecution successfully argued that her actions demonstrated a level of intent and awareness. The case hinged on whether Sydney was mentally capable of understanding the wrongfulness of her actions at the time of the crime. This is a crucial element in determining legal insanity, and both sides presented compelling arguments. As Sydney serves her sentence, her case continues to raise important questions about the role of mental illness in the criminal justice system. Should individuals like Sydney, who suffer from severe mental health disorders, be treated as criminals, or should the focus be on rehabilitation and treatment? These are questions that will likely continue to be debated as more cases like Sydney's emerge. For now, Sydney remains in prison, with the possibility of parole in 2038.
We're diving into a case today that really makes you think differently about crime and, taking responsibility for your actions. It's the story of Sydney Powell.
Yeah.
Outwardly a regular college student. But behind that, there was this whole other thing going on, and it ended up being really tragic.
It's one of those stories that reminds us that things aren't always what they seem, especially when you're talking about mental health.
Exactly. And we did our homework on this one. This isn't just like, some sensational thing we saw in the news. We've got court documents, psych evaluations, the whole thing.
It works.
Yeah. We want to understand how this young woman, who seemed totally normal, could be accused of something as awful as murdering her own mother, Brenda Powell.
And what's really disturbing about it, what makes this case stick with you, is that it forces us to think about this really tough question. When someone's dealing with a serious mental illness, where do we draw the line between personal responsibility and, just not being in control?
Right. So let's go back to 2020. Sydney's a student, supposedly, at the University of Mount Union. At least, that's what her parents think.
And that illusion that she was able to keep up for so long, it's often a key part of these cases.
Because, turns out, she'd been kicked out. Failing grades. She hid it from her family, even lived in hotels near campus and everything, just pretending to go to class.
Wow. The pressure of keeping that up, all that lying.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if maybe her mind was already starting to go. And that's before we even get to the diagnosis she got later.
Oh, right. After everything happened while Sydney was in custody, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. For those of us who aren't doctors, can you explain what that actually means?
Sure. Schizophrenia, it's a serious mental illness, and people misunderstand it a lot. It's not just about, quirky thoughts or acting a little strange. This is about how someone's whole perception of reality is messed up.
Yeah.
They might hallucinate, have delusions, their thinking gets all jumbled. It can really take over your life.
And this diagnosis, it wasn't just some kind of Hail Mary to get her out of trouble, right?
No, not at all. In Sydney's case, there were several different psychiatrists, all working separately, and they all came to the same conclusion: schizophrenia. This wasn't a guess, it was a clear diagnosis.
So if this was already going on, why didn't anyone see it? I mean, her parents seemed close to her.
Well, schizophrenia usually shows up in your late teens, early 20s. That's already a tough time for a lot of people. Lots of changes and stress. So early signs like being withdrawn, weird sleep habits, trouble focusing people, brush it off as just typical teenage stuff, or the pressure of college.
Makes you wonder, if someone had noticed those signs sooner, gotten her some help, could this whole thing have been avoided?
That's the question that lingers in so many cases like Sydney's. It really highlights how crucial it is to be aware of mental health, especially with young people. Early diagnosis, getting treatment, it can completely change someone's life.
It's just, you can't imagine keeping up a lie like that for so long.
Right.
And then Brenda gets a call from the university.
Just a normal day,
Yeah.
And then it all goes sideways. Brenda's at home, doesn't know the thing about what's really happening with Sydney.
And then the phone rings, university officials, and they tell her the news: Sydney's been expelled. Not just flunking out, but full on expelled.
Wow.
I can't imagine what Brenda was feeling. Confusion, anger, probably feeling betrayed, but also definitely worried about her daughter.
You have to remember, Brenda worked with kids, right? As a child life specialist. So her first thought wouldn't be to yell or anything. She'd want to figure out what was going on and help Sydney through it.
Totally. This wasn't about grades, really. It was about Sydney's whole future, her mental state. It makes sense that Brenda would want to talk to her face to face. We know Sydney's at a hotel nearby, still living this lie.
And we don't know everything about what happened next. The timeline's a little fuzzy, but the police reports say Brenda went to go see Sydney that same day.
Okay, so back at the Powell house, what should have been a conversation, a chance for Sydney to explain, it goes a completely different direction.
It escalated. And the really awful thing is, Brenda never hung up the phone with the university people.
Oh my gosh.
They're still on the line, they hear the whole thing, not even realizing what's happening at first. Thuds, screaming, something breaking.
It's hard to even think about. They're just listening and they become witnesses to this awful murder.
Yeah.
Just adds another layer of tragedy to the whole thing.
And the sounds they heard, they tell a story. Police report describes a really violent scene. Brenda was hit with a cast iron skillet and then stabbed multiple times.
It's hard to wrap your head around that level of violence, especially in a family.
And it's important to remember that while forensic people often see that kind of overkill as a sign of intense emotion, we don't really know what was going on in Sydney's head in those moments. We may never know.
And then to make things even more complicated, when the police got there, Sydney's behavior was really strange. She was hysterical, saying someone had broken in and attacked her mom.
At first, it almost makes sense. A young woman, clearly traumatized, and you have this horrible crime scene. But then you look at the evidence, and it's not adding up.
Yeah, like the bloody footprints matched her shoes, and they found traces of her mom's blood on her clothes. It all pointed to a different story than the one Sydney was trying to tell.
And that's where this case goes from who did it to why did they do it. The evidence said Sydney did it, but the big question was her mental state when it happened.
So it's not about proving if she did it, but if she understood what she was doing.
Right. And when this goes to trial, the courtroom becomes a battle between these expert witnesses, each telling a different side of the story.
And in the middle of it all is Sydney's family, just completely devastated. So the trial gets going, and it's really all about this young woman diagnosed with schizophrenia, accused of this horrific thing. I can just imagine everyone in that courtroom, on edge as they wait for the prosecution and the defense to make their case.
And you have to remember, this wasn't just about proving she was guilty or not. Sydney's mental state at the time of the murder, it was like this shadow hanging over everything, every piece of evidence, every word from the witnesses.
The prosecution wasn't saying she was totally in her right mind when she attacked her mom, right? What was their strategy?
They focused on what Sydney did right after it happened. They said that by trying to make the scene look different, to stall the police, it showed that she understood what she had done, at least on some level, that there was some premeditation there, even if her sense of reality was messed up.
So they were saying she had schizophrenia, but she still knew what she was doing was wrong.
Yeah, that's basically it. They were saying that even if she was really sick, deep down, she knew she messed up and had to hide it.
And the defense, they went with the insanity plea, right? But how do you convince a jury that someone who did something so violent wasn't really in control?
They built their case on the testimony of three mental health experts. They'd all examined Sydney on their own, and they all agreed schizophrenia. They all said that when she killed her mom, she was having a psychotic break, a really bad one, so bad she didn't know what she was doing was wrong.
So now it's like these two really strong arguments clashing. On one side, this terrible crime. On the other side, this young woman struggling with a really serious mental illness. So what did the jury do? What did they decide?
After thinking about it for weeks, they came back with a verdict. Guilty of murder.
Wow. Guilty. Even with the schizophrenia diagnosis, even with the insanity plea, it wasn't enough.
And that's the thing about mental illness and the legal system. It's so complicated. The jury, they decided that even though she was sick, Sydney was still responsible for what she did. A decision like that, it always gets people talking about accountability, about compassion, about what's fair in these kinds of cases.
What was her sentence?
Life in prison. But she could be eligible for parole after 15 years.
Life in prison, even with parole, that's a long time. What about her family? How are they dealing with this? Especially her father, Steve. He always seems so supportive.
He's still there for Sydney, 100%. He truly believes it was the illness that caused her to do this, not who she really is as a person. To have that kind of forgiveness, that empathy, even though it's just something this awful, it makes you think.
It really does. It makes you think about all the families going through these impossible situations. Are there resources out there for them? For people like Steve, support groups, anything. That's something I hope our listeners will look into.
You're right. We don't talk about that side of things enough. These families, their lives are changed forever. They've lost someone, and they're also dealing with the stigma of mental illness. It's a lot.
This whole case is just heartbreaking and so complicated. If our listeners take away one thing from this deep dive, I hope it's this. We have to understand mental illness better. We need more awareness, more compassion, and we need to support early intervention and treatment. If you or someone you know is struggling, please reach out for help. There are resources available. You don't have to go through this alone.
The trial of Sydney Powell highlighted the complexities of balancing mental health issues with criminal responsibility. While the defense presented strong evidence of Sydney's schizophrenia, the jury ultimately sided with the prosecution, which argued that her actions during and after the murder showed intent. The court's decision to sentence Sydney to life in prison, despite her family's plea for leniency and mental health treatment, underscores the challenges faced by individuals suffering from mental illness within the criminal justice system. As Sydney serves her sentence, her case continues to raise important questions about the treatment of mentally ill offenders and the intersection of mental health and the law.